Welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. I'm Rebecca Elliott. Monday, May the 20th, marked International Clinical Trials Day, which was established to honour James Lind, who was considered the first physician to conduct a controlled clinical trial way back in 1747. Many teams conduct clinical trials here at the Doherty Institute, including the Vaccine Research Group led by Professor Michelle Giles. Michelle joins me on the podcast today to discuss why clinical trials are so important and how participating in one could lead to new medicines and vaccines. Michelle, welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained.
Great to be here, Beck. Thanks for having me.
So firstly, Michelle, what exactly is a clinical trial?
So a clinical trial is where people volunteer to be participants, and it may be that they try a new medication or a new vaccine or a new therapy is tested. And so in summary, a clinical trial is where we test a new method to usually understand aspects of health and diagnosis and screening better to improve outcomes for people. But the most important things is they're voluntary and they're participants who give up their time to be a part of them.
And why are they so important in the research pipeline?
Clinical trials are really essential to improving health. We wouldn't be where we are today if there hadn't been clinical trials performed previously. And really, in the majority of cases of clinical trials, we're trying to improve either testing, improve our understanding of diagnosis, or improve, importantly, prevention or treatment. So it gives us new information. It may give us information about exciting new initiatives or exciting new treatments, but overall, usually the main aim is to improve the health of people.
And so every drug on the market would have been through a clinical trial, I assume?
Yeah, correct. So in a country like Australia, we have a regulator, the TGA, and all medication that people are familiar with and all vaccines have to go through a process where they're actually trialled under rigorous and safe conditions to make sure that they work. That's really important, to make sure that they're also safe, and then they have to be approved for use in Australia.
We'll get to the safety shortly, but there are many types of clinical trials. What are some of the most common?
Yeah, I kind of think of trials as three broad groups. So one is what we call screening trials, and that might be where we test a new way of diagnosing a condition or a disease. And then there are diagnostic trials, and this is where we might compare tests to diagnose different conditions and improve the way we can make diagnoses. And then the one that probably most people are familiar with is treatment trials, and that's where we might test a new treatment or a combination of medications or vaccines. And often within those treatment trials, people might have heard of different phases. So we think about phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 trials. Often phase 1 is the earliest ones, and this is when a medication or a vaccine might be tested in humans for the first time. A phase 2 is the next stage along, which is really looking at safety and maybe the dose of the medication or the strength of a vaccine that is to be given. And then the third phase is the most advanced phase in clinical trials, and this is where we look at how well that treatment or that vaccine might work in bigger numbers of people to either treat the disease that you're interested in or to prevent the disease if you're looking at a vaccine. So those are phase 1, 2 and 3 clinical trials.
So let's just say that you have a medicine, for example. How much time would it take to actually get to a clinical trial stage?
Oh, it can really vary. So it's often many years, though. We think about preclinical work, so what might start in a laboratory with discovery of a new molecule or a new medicine or the development of a vaccine. That usually starts, as I said, in the laboratory, and then it might be tested in animal models, for example. So before it even reaches humans, it would be tested or trialled in animal models. And then it progresses to the first in human stage. And sometimes that work can be decades in the making, or it might be shorter, but there is a lot of work that goes on well before it's trialled in a human for the first time.
And once we are at the human study phase, how long do those phases 1, 2, 3 usually go for?
Yeah, a great question. Again, it's a bit variable depending on the number of people that you want to test in. Depends on how long you're following. It takes you to recruit those people and how long you follow them up for. And usually they're sequential. So usually you complete phase 1 and have the results before you move into phase 2, and then you complete phase 2. And some phase 2 studies will be many months or longer, and you wait for those results and then you proceed to phase 3. One of the things we saw in COVID that sped up the process was, rather than having those phases sequentially, there was some overlap. So that's a way of shortening the time without necessarily cutting corners. So we still had those 3 phases, but we didn't have to wait till one phase was complete and all of the data was analysed before moving on to the next phase.
We talk about the gold standard in clinical trials. Can you explain what they mean by the gold standard?
So the gold standard we often think about in clinical trials is what's called a randomised control trial. And that is where you invite participants to be a part of the study, and you might be looking at a drug or a vaccine and you compare it to placebo. So you don't know if the person is going to get the medication or the person's going to get the placebo, which is essentially nothing, and the patient doesn't know, and people are randomly, by chance, if you like, allocated to one of those 2 groups. And the reason that those sort of studies are so powerful is because there's less bias introduced. In other words, they're less likely to be influenced by people choosing to be in a particular group or knowing which group they're in. So that's the gold standard, but there are many clinical trials that are done that are not necessarily randomised controlled trials or necessarily have a placebo arm. It depends on what stage that medicine or that vaccine is in their development.
So how are participants selected and recruited for a clinical trial?
So it depends a little bit on the trial. It depends what you are investigating and in what population you're particularly interested in. So different medicines and different vaccines may have a different target population. It could be children, it could be young adults, it could be older adults, it may be participants that have healthy participants with no other medical conditions, or it might be older adults that have medical conditions. So depending on your population of interest, we often recruit differently for those studies. So first of all, having access to that population is important. So if you had a study designed for pregnant women, then you would obviously advertise your study or talk about your study with people who are involved with and look after pregnant women, including pregnant women themselves, of course. If you are trialling a study in children, then your audience and the people you need to talk to about those studies to recruit participants would be, parents with young children. If it's a trial in young children, you might talk to paediatric colleagues about the study. So the method of recruitment and how you select participants is really dictated by what we call your target population. So, and usually your target population is the group where you think that medicine or vaccine is going to benefit the most. That's how we choose those target populations.
And how might someone from the general public get to know about clinical trials and if they're interested in participating?
So there's a range of ways. They might hear about it on social media. They might be part of databases where they've given their information to be a part of a database and be notified if there is a trial that's coming up. They may hear about it through their medical practitioner, so their GP, or if they have a medical condition and they attend a health service, they might hear about a trial through a hospital or their health service. They may hear about it through friends and family. So there's a variety of ways that people can hear about clinical trials.
And a very important question, how do you ensure the safety of participants during a clinical trial? We'll have the answer to that question in just a moment, but just a quick break to say that if you're enjoying the podcast, why not share it with your family and friends or rate and review it on your favourite podcasting app?
Yeah, really important. There are a number of ways that we ensure the safety. I think the first thing to say is that clinical trials should be run by people who are very experienced in clinical trials. All clinical trials have to be approved by an ethics committee, and that's really important to protect the safety of participants. So before anyone goes onto a clinical trial, they can be reassured that it's approved by an ethics committee. Then there's usually a process of informed consent. And what that means is that you go through in detail what's involved in the trial, what are the potential risks to a participant, what are the potential benefits to the participant, among a range of other things. But part of that process is also to make sure that the participants understand what they're getting into and making sure that it's appropriate for them and it's safe for them. And then throughout the whole trial process, experienced clinical trial sites use a team usually comprising of doctors and nurses and research assistants who have a lot of experience in clinical trials, who have done training in clinical trials as well, to make sure that any safety concerns are made aware of, they're acted upon and are treated and responded to appropriately. So there's very close follow-up of people on clinical trials, depending on the trial. That might be, so we run vaccine trials. An example is we have what's called an e-diary after the vaccination. So we have daily recording of the participants' experience on that trial. And if they report anything they're worried about, we can act on that straight away. So there's lots of those sort of mechanisms that are in place to ensure the safety for participants.
Are participants reimbursed for their time, or how does that work?
So it depends on the clinical trial. But certainly with our group who do vaccine trials, all of our participants are reimbursed for their time. And that's really to acknowledge that they are giving up their time voluntarily. Sometimes people have to take, half a day off work, or they have to come and they give blood. And so we provide them, we cover the costs of their time and car parking, for example, and things like that. So I think it's really a fair acknowledgement of these people who are generously giving up their time to help medical research.
So, Michelle, tell me a little bit more about your group, the Vaccine Research Group.
Yeah, we're a group of doctors, nurses and research assistants who have been performing vaccine trials in participants for many years now. We have done vaccine trials across the lifespan, so to children, to babies, to pregnant women and to adults. And I mentioned earlier the different phases of trials, phase 1, 2 and 3, and our vaccine research group have been involved in all of those different phases for different vaccines. So at the moment we are doing a trial looking at infection called CMV or cytomegalovirus. We're doing a trial of a COVID vaccine, and we're doing a trial of an RSV or respiratory syncytial virus vaccine. And all of those different trials we're running are targeting different populations, like I mentioned earlier.
Now, I do want to talk specifically about the RSV vaccine study. Firstly, what is RSV?
Yeah, RSV, that stands for respiratory syncytial virus, and it's a virus that really affects nearly all of us. But I think only recently people have started to hear more about it, and that's because it's an exciting time actually in RSV research. There's many products now that are available to prevent this infection or to prevent people getting this disease. And that's really important because RSV causes a lot of severe disease actually in young children. Many of us might have had children and don't realise that one of the times they've come home with a really runny, snotty nose and an upper respiratory tract infection was actually RSV. But croup is something that many parents might have heard of, and it can cause bronchiolitis or croup. So in really severe cases, it can cause death. So RSV is an important virus, and we don't have a treatment for it. So prevention is really important. So RSV now, there are vaccines that have been developed for pregnant women. There's also preventives called monoclonal antibodies that are available for young infants. And RSV also can cause severe lung disease in older adults. So there's also RSV vaccines being developed for older adults. And the study that we're currently doing with the RSV vaccine is actually looking at 18 to 49-year-olds, so adults, but who have other medical conditions that may put them at risk of severe RSV disease. So things like diabetes, asthma, lung disease, kidney disease. So adults that have those medical conditions, our study is recruiting those participants and giving them an RSV vaccine and then measuring their immune response to it and comparing their immune response to older adults in whom the vaccine is already registered and licensed in Australia.
So what are you hoping to achieve from the study?
Our main goal of this study is to look at what we call immunogenicity, or that's how the body's immune system responds to the vaccine, particularly in adults who have those other medical conditions. So we want to see that group have a really good and strong response to the vaccine so that we can make decisions down the track about whether that vaccine should be recommended in those populations.
So what should a person consider before joining any clinical trial, and this trial in particular?
I think there's a few important things for people to consider. One is they need to know that it's voluntary, that joining a trial often requires a commitment. So that commitment, we ideally want people who are going to stay on the trial for the whole duration. So the RSV study that I mentioned is for 6 months. So we really need people to understand what's required and to be willing to commit to all of the components of the trial, which is not just the duration, but if there's visits involved or blood tests involved, that they're happy to consent to all of those things. So I think they need to think about whether they're willing and able to participate in all of the components of the study, and then have a really good understanding of what's involved and whether it's personally the right thing for them to be a part of. So it's, as I mentioned, it's voluntary, they can withdraw at any time, but it's also important to commit. So understanding everything that's involved before signing up is really, really the key.
And are there any sort of procedures or tests that a participant must undergo before enrolment?
So for this RSV study, there's not, but what we do for our vaccine trials, and it's quite common in many clinical trials, particularly with medication or a vaccine, is there's what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria. What that really means is there's a list of things that may make someone eligible for the study. So it might be the age. So our study is for 18 and above. So if you were 16, you would be ineligible for this study, as an example. And we go through that list just to make sure before anyone signs the consent form or gets the product that they're actually eligible. And sometimes there's actually exclusion criteria. So they might be on a medication that makes them ineligible for the study. So we run through that particular list before they actually join the clinical trial. But there's no, at least for the RSV study, there are other trials where you might have to have a blood test first to check if you're eligible, or you might have to have an ECG to check that you're eligible. But actually for this particular trial we're talking about, there's no specific procedure or test that they have to undergo first.
And what support is available for participants during and after a trial like this one?
So the feedback we get from participants generally is that they actually quite enjoy being on a trial because they are really well supported. And that's certainly the feedback we like to hear. So we have a team that spend quite a bit of time with potential participants before they sign up to the trial, just to make sure that they understand everything involved, they're eligible. And then once they're on the trial, the option of contact as often as they like with the staff that work on the trial. But there's also contact before upcoming visits, during upcoming visits, after the visits. So there is a lot of, we work really hard actually to build rapport with our participants. We're really grateful for their time and what they give up to be part of our trial. So we really like to try and support them as much as we can and build those relationships that are trusted, so that they feel they can reach out to us if they have any concerns or if they have anything that we can help support them with. But most of the feedback we get is that they feel really well connected and well supported whilst on the trials.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. How are the results of a clinical trial shared with the public?
The traditional way, I think the most common way that results of clinical trials are shared, and it depends on the trial itself and which phase it's in and the type of trial, but is often through publication in scientific journals, peer review, what we call peer reviewed journals. Results can also be presented at medical conferences, but sometimes that's not always accessible to the public. So that's often accessible to the scientific community, but not necessarily the public. So we always like to provide feedback to our participants at the end of a trial, and it may not be immediately after they finish on the trial because there's a lag between getting all of those results and then having it synthesized in a way that is able to be communicated with participants. But we like to communicate directly with our participants at some point after the conclusion of the trial about the outcome of the trial. And then there are other ways that the public find out about trial results, and that's a little bit more ad hoc. That might be through the media or through social media once results are made more public.
Well, if our listeners think they might be eligible for your RSV vaccine trial, how can they potentially get involved?
Well, we would love any of your listeners to contact us if they're interested in being part of the RSV trial. We're also happy, even if the RSV trial is not quite right for them, to contact us if they'd like to go on our database, because we have a large database, over 5,000 people from the years of experience in vaccine trials, and they can join our database so we can contact them by email if they like for any future opportunities for vaccine trials. But the way to contact us is to either call us on 8344 9325 or our mobile 0418 322 346, or you can email us, and I'll give you the email address. It's Virgo, VIRGO -studies, STUDIES, so all one word with a hyphen, at unimelb, unimelb.edu.au.
Well, hopefully you'll get a lot of sign-ups after people listen to this podcast. Thank you so much for all the information you've provided to me today, Michelle. Thanks so much for joining me.
Pleasure. Thanks, Beck.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. If there is a specific topic you would like us to cover, please get in touch with us by emailing doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. That's doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please rate and review on your favourite podcasting app and subscribe if you haven't already. The Doherty Institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. See you next time.